good to see everybody here again. I was talking to you last time I came to you through a video about Chinese isolationism. Now it's going to be talking about Japanese unification and isolation. Now, the Chinese got themselves isolated starting around 1433. The Japanese, it's about 2 centuries after that. So you're looking in the 1630s for the Japanese to begin their isolation. But this isn't just about isolationism, it's also going to be about their unification. So I'm going to sit there and bring myself back into the corner, just like that, and then start talking to you about Japanese unification and isolationism. In order to be isolated, you got to have contact with others. And the Chinese and the Koreans had had contact with the Japanese for a long period of time, but really I'm talking about European contact. The Portuguese are the first to do that. In 1543, a couple of Portuguese sailors wash up on Japanese shores. Now, it's not like they were holding on to just a couple of remnants of a ship or anything like that. They were in what we would nowadays think of as more of a lifeboat, a small little vessel like that. They brought with them knowledge of Christianity and, of course, firearms. Now, somehow, miraculously, their powder was able to stay dry. And by powder, I mean gunpowder. And they were able to show the Japanese how their firearms worked. The Japanese, to their credit, were intrigued, but also more than willing to take this technology and adopt it and adapt it to their own needs. Now, it'll take a little bit of time, but it does happen. Oda Nobunaga, guy who's coming on up in the next slide, is going to be a real master at that. But Japanese swordsmiths that were the blacksmiths making swords, they're going to be given the job of taking some of these European weapons, taking them apart, figuring out how they worked, and to start making their own versions of these things. The Portuguese sailors do eventually get back to Portugal, tell the stories about what they saw in Japan, and Portugal begins trading with the Japanese. And they bring stuff like tobacco and eyeglasses, firearms, of course, knowledge of Christianity, those sorts of things. The Portuguese want to keep all this to themselves. However, other nations will start to trade with Japan as well. Oda Nobunaga, he is going to be the first of these three daimyo. Warlords is really a good word for them. A daimyo is a large landholder that has a private army of samurai. And in Japanese history, collectively there are three known as the three unifiers, and Oda Nobunaga is the first of those. He is a daimyo who wants to unify Japan. In other words, get all of those little warlords under his control and rule the empire by force, as was his motto. He seized the capital of Kyoto, which is where the emperor lived. Now, the emperor of Japan was of an extremely high status. Socially, culturally, he had a lot of influence. But when it comes to political power, the emperor had almost none. But if you were seen as a favorite of the emperor, that would only have your esteem rise in the eyes of other Japanese people. So by having the capital Kyoto under his control, he effectively had the emperor under his control as well. He also realized that training samurai is expensive and it takes years. To become really a good soldier with those two swords, and also to be decent at archery and horseback riding and all the other things that samurai did, it took a lot of training and it took a lot of time. But if you're able to get some firearms, put those firearms into the hands of peasants and train them how to effectively aim and fire those guns, all of a sudden a peasant rises in power and might be able to go toe-to-toe with some of those samurai in opposing armies. That was going to foreshadow big things that will happen later on in Japan. In 1582, he does commit seppuku, ritual suicide, when he was betrayed by one of his generals. Which leads to the middle, or the next, of the three unifiers, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He is Nobunaga's best general. Obviously, he's not the one that betrayed him. And he tries to achieve Oda Nobunaga's goals. By 1590, Hideyoshi had about 90-ish or so percent of Japan under his control, either through alliances, brute force, guile, whatever. He had most of Japan. And this is also the period of time where it starts to slip through his fingers. It was as if he thought unification was a done deal, and he tried to invade Korea, and that Korean invasion went rather poorly. And the worse the Japanese did in Korea, the more parts and pieces of Japan began slipping away. He dies in 1598, but that doesn't tell the full story. A little bit of extra that you wouldn't have gotten in a textbook or anything like that. Hideyoshi, he had no son of his own. By the time he was into his late 50s, early 60s, he did not have an heir, like a Henry VIII kind of a problem. So, what he did was adopt one of his nephews and said that the nephew was his actual son and was going to be his heir. And this worked out well, except for the nephew being kind of a bad guy. He used to ride through the countryside cutting the heads off of farmers just for fun because, hey, he had that kind of authority and nobody was going to be able to do anything about it. His adopted dad, would just let it happen until in his about 60 years, at about 60 years old, he has his own biological son. And that biological son, he's going to call Hideyori. Now, Hideyori becomes the love of his life. And guess what's going to happen to that adopted son who was not so nice a guy? Yep, the adopted son and his entire family, because he had a wife and he had some kids. Some of the kids were even younger than 5 years old. They were collected and he was forced to commit seppuku, and the rest of them were killed because Hideyoshi knew that the adopted son would always be a threat to his biological son. His biological son doesn't fare too well either. Before Hideyoshi dies, he gathers some of his generals, including the guy on the next slide, together to make them promise not to harm his son. It was a promise that ends up not being kept. But more on that later, too. Oh, but to go back for a second, Hideyoshi, he also understands that, hey, peasants with guns might not be such a good idea. He actually goes on a hunt to try and get swords and firearms out of the regular peasants' hands and into only his own, or his army's own. Tokugawa Ieyasu. This guy, he is the last of the three unifiers, and he's the one that successfully gets Japan unified 100%. He goes into battle at a place called Sekigahara in 1600. And during the course of this battle, for the long story short, he was outnumbered. Partway through the battle, one of the daimyo on the other side switches allegiance to Ieyasu, and Ieyasu is able to become victorious. And it was at that point in 1600 where realistically nobody else was able to put as much power and manpower and force onto a battlefield. Tokugawa Ieyasu begins the Tokugawa Shogunate at that point in time. Now, officially, it'll start around 1603, but unofficially, 1600 on, it's it. He is now the shogun. He is now the head military commander of all Japan. He is the one in charge. The emperor still has a great status, but the emperor still doesn't have political power. His capital city is Edo, and that becomes the capital of the entire country. It will eventually change its name to the modern day city of Tokyo, which is still the capital of Japan to this day. He also has a policy in which it's known as the alternate attendance policy, in which other daimyos would have to come and stay with him for a year. So, you know the old saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer? That's exactly what he was doing with that. But those daimyo would also have to go back to their own areas in order to, take care of business there, make sure that crops are being collected and deal with any kinds of matters of law and issues along those lines. So in those alternating years, the daimyo's family, especially think eldest son, wives too, would have to spend time in Edo. This way, he meaning Tokugawa Ieyasu, always had a hostage ready to go if the daimyo themselves weren't there. This alternate attendance policy is what enables Tokugawa Ieyasu and later on his descendants to maintain a firm, tight control over Japan. By the 1630s, though, Japan is becoming more and more isolationist. Hence this picture right here where you can see Japan surrounded by this red circle. It's a lot easier to isolate an island than it is other locations. All you got to do is control the boats going in and out. First is for cultural reasons. A lot of people, especially those samurai, didn't like how peasants were able to go toe to toe with the samurai with the firearm. Also, Jesuit missionaries, Catholic Christian missionaries, were coming from places like Spain and Portugal, and they were doing a really good job of converting Japanese people to Christianity. By 1600, they had 300,000 Japanese Christians. The missionaries that were doing this, though, also got involved in local politics and were upsetting some of the cultural things that the Japanese had been used to. Plus, Christianity stresses loyalty to God, not to a shogun. The shogun certainly didn't appreciate that too much. Additionally, politically, the shogun feared a Christian rebellion. One of the things that Tokugawa Ieyasu and his descendants were always worried about is those other daimyo trying to rise up and overthrow their power. So if there were a bunch of Christian daimyo, that might be enough to unite them in opposition to him. He didn't want a Christian rebellion. Matter of fact, there was a rebellion that starts in 1637 on the Shimabara Peninsula, and it was blamed on Christians, although it was really more started by taxes and it became a Christianity thing. Christians get persecuted relentlessly. There's actually a great number of Japanese Christian martyrs that come out during this time period. So, what did they do? They isolated Japan with a series of laws. They banned Christianity, persecuted them. They burned any big ocean going vessels so that these vessels wouldn't be able to leave Japan and bring back new things that would just upset the apple cart over there in Japan. If you're a Japanese person and you were already off the islands when these laws were passed, you were not allowed back in under penalty of death. Foreigners who landed in Japan were to be killed. And the Japanese would relentlessly kill some of the Portuguese missionaries that would come after this and some other delegates from Portugal as well. The idea was to control foreign ideas and stop foreign ideas from coming into Japan. And this is really what happened effectively for about 225 years or so. 1868 is when it stops. Now, when it stops, I mean the whole Tokugawa shogunate stops. In the 1850s, the United States is able to force open the doors of Japan with a sailor known as Commodore Matthew Perry. No relation to the Matthew Perry from Friends. And it's at that point in time where Japan could really see the writing on the wall. Their isolationism had effectively put the country on hold for over 200 years while all these other nations continued on with their technological advancements. Japan couldn't stop people from coming into their country after the 1850s, and it is the United States that kicks open the door. Thank you very much for listening to me. Hope that you learned something, and make sure that you got those notes completed. Peace out.